Most of life seems external to us. The work we do, the faith we practice, the way we spend our time and money. People have long been obsessed with using external things to define themselves and even their worship of God. But Jesus pushed the conversation deeper. He made worship a matter of the heart. Most people think of worship as just songs and music. We think worship is something we do in a church service on Sunday mornings. But the Bible calls us to a life of worship. We honor God with our songs and praise, but all of life is an opportunity to show God honor. We worship best when we make it a lifestyle, expressing our gratitude, prioritizing our time with Him, purifying our heart and actions, and generously offering our life as a sacrifice to others. We worship as we honor God with our whole life, for that is ultimately the whole purpose of our creation and our greatest joy, glorifying and honoring God. Most people don't recognize how serious the Pharisees were about practicing their faith. We usually think of them as opponents of Jesus, the bad guys. But the Pharisees thought of themselves as the protectors of true worship. In a world where most were compromising their faith for acceptance in society, the Pharisees were determined to keep their worship pure and uncompromising. They went to radical lengths to do that. Jesus recognized how this desire to be outwardly pure and faithful to God had become a rigid shell that left people's hearts unchanged. It had become a rigid system of worship that didn't possess the power to change hearts. Jesus used a prophecy from Isaiah to make his point. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce. Those are strong words, but Jesus understood the danger of what the Pharisees were doing. He explained to them that it wasn't these external things like food and the surfaces that made them unclean. Instead, it was what was already in their heart. They were using external worship as a way to cover up the corruption of their heart. You can see why they were offended by Jesus. Jesus' words are a warning for us too. We can get all of the behavior and external practices right and not really be changed in any internal way. We can do good with all the wrong motives. Jesus was always after the heart. He understood that it was from the heart that our real worship always flows, either in a kind of rigid self-preservation or in a humble turning toward God for help. In his Beatitudes, Jesus called this purity of heart. He promised that those who had a pure heart would see God. What does it mean to have a pure heart? One way to think of that phrase is that you desire a single thing. Your heart wants one thing, to know Jesus. It's unpolluted in its desires. The problem, of course, is that our hearts want all sorts of things. It's why Jesus went on to say that we must also hunger and thirst for righteousness, a righteousness that is not our own. The one thing our hearts can long for is following Jesus. That would rework our hearts in ways we couldn't on our own. This was the thing the Pharisees couldn't do. Their form of worship depended on demonstrations of purity. Instead, our heart's purest desire is for Christ to save us. Any worship that distracts us from our need for Him is no worship at all. This is the worship that comes by spirit and truth. God's Spirit doing what we cannot, and the acknowledged truth that it's what we most need. Worship begins with honesty before God and a willingness to let Him do the work. What motivates our obedience to God? Why do you worship? Is it to prove something? To demonstrate something? Or is your worship a pure heart crying out for God's salvation, for His presence, His grace, peace, and the new life, the new heart He's promised?